On today's World Insight, after unveiling China's blueprint on becoming a mid-level developed country, Chinese leaders seek to steer the nation on an even keel toward the Chinese path to modernization. As part of our New Vision, New Mission series, a look at how China plans to reach new goals of high-quality, innovation-driven development. And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China concluded last week in Beijing. The week-long event has mapped out a blueprint for China's future development. The Congress passed a resolution on the report of the 19th CPC Central Committee. The report established the goal of uniting and leading people of all ethnic groups in the country to build a powerful, modern socialist country in all aspects and to advance the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on all fronts through a Chinese path to modernization. The meeting also approved an amendment to the party's constitution, including statements on gradually realizing the goal of common prosperity for all, having an accurate understanding of the new state of development, and applying a new philosophy of innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared development. On that, we bring you the New Vision, New Mission special series to discuss how China can fulfill the goals and tasks set out for the new journey. Let's bring in our panelists. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Yukong Huang, Senior Associate in the Carnegie Asia Program. He focuses on China's economic development and its impact on Asia and the global economy. In Beijing, Professor Fu Jun, Academic Dean from the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. In Shenzhen, Xiao Geng, Director of the Institute of Policy and Practice. Professor Xiao is with Shenzhen Finance Institute of Chinese University of Hong Kong in Shenzhen. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Several new terminologies coming out of the 20th CPC Party Congress. Now, Mr. Huang, you've been doing research about China and also was in China for years during China's reform and opening up era. Tell me more about what is your understanding of the Chinese path to modernization.
You can sense a degree of difference between the statements that have been made this year compared to the ones which were made 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And what I think was different to me was that the words, for example, economy and reform were not mentioned as often as they have been in the past, although they were in the statements of this party Congress. But what was mentioned much more frequently than anything we've seen before is the word security, as well as technology. And this, I think, reflects a different world. Basically, China is trying to deal with what I call security in many aspects. There's tensions with the West, so you have political security. There is a drive to become more self-sufficient in producing high-tech products like semiconductors. So you want to be technologically more secure. There's health security. So I think what is going to be the different characteristic in the years to come is the focus on security a bit more than things like growth rates or the economy. And I think this is going to be a big issue that has to be addressed in the coming years.
So you do not see necessarily the so-called Chinese path to modernization as the key difference this time, but rather the security and development, which is being mentioned in what context?
I think modernization was in this statement, it's been in the past. It's going to take decades, a generation. I think that the key issue is how do you get there? And I think that was not highlighted too much in the 20th Party Congress is that China's growth prospects have turned to become fairly alarming in some sense. Growth this year is going to be around perhaps 3%. If you forecast into the immediate future, it's actually hard to see economic growth increasing significantly.
There is also increasing mention of a common prosperity in the sense that the good life should be shared by every member of the Chinese society. Now, how do you see this aspect of the emphasis vis-a-vis the emphasis on the economic growth prospects?
Our population is about 1/5 of the world's population. So you are not just talking about an economist to say it's a one nation state. It's a big size of the world economy. Now, in terms of share of the world economy, it's getting close. If my reading is accurate now, it's very much above 18% of the total size of the world economy, coming from a number that was almost negligible 40 years ago. Now, normally, for our economy to behave normally, 1/5 of the world's population should be producing 1/5 of the total GDP of the world. Now we are getting there. And what does that mean? That means in the past 40 years, our economy was very much dependent on the world economy. And given the size now, it's 20% of the total size of the world economy. We have to look increasingly towards the domestic market. And we have been talking about the supply side reforms. So much so that probably we have neglected the demand side of the economy. Now it's time for us China to strike a better balance between demand side and also supply side. And there, it is easy to understand why we have to emphasize common prosperity, because without a robust domestic market, it is very, very difficult to sustain the continued growth of the economy. And if I compare Chinese economy with the other emerging markets, China has been doing well in terms of growth rates. We still have room to improve in terms of growth with in an equitable sense. And now it is important, and it's time for us to highlight that issue.
Professor Xiao, your thoughts as an economist?
Well, I think the 20th Congress is focusing on some of the medium and long-term challenges. And the major challenge actually comes from the external environment, as Yukun has outlined very clearly. And I think that the modernization is the objective, and how to achieve it. I think the Congress proposed some very specific political approach that is basically, the party as the guardian of this transition to modernization. And I think there's a clear emphasis on how the party should discipline itself, and also how I think the political leadership should be much more coordinated and effective in dealing with external uncertainties. So I think this gives most people impression that the new team is trying to do something, to deal with this very serious challenges, both from outside and also internally. I think particularly the short-term economy.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. You see the word Chinese and the unique things like that has been mentioned several times in the report compared to previous times. This is taking place with the context of global fragmentation and also falling of global narratives, for example, about globalization and many other things. So how do you see that China's policy paper, the CPC, specifically are trying to balance, China being part of the world and China's own unique approach?
Well, let me comment upon this uniqueness. What makes China unique is that the role of the state is so much larger in China than it is in other countries. That means that China can influence where money or resources flow to a greater extent than you can in Europe and the United States. So China looks at the world and asks, what does China want to be like, let's say 20, 30 years down the line? There is much more what I call modern manufacturing, more innovative economy, more technologically driven. So here's a country like China, it can actually steer resources into these new areas. So you have what I would call these little giants, new companies which are going into new areas, getting support from the government. That makes China different to a large extent. The other extent I think China is quite different, it can steer a lot of overall investment into regional issues more so than you see in the United States and the West. So a large share, for example, of China's public money, the infrastructure money, has been going to the far West, the poorer provinces. And this has contributed to what I call the common prosperity. So it's this control of resources and being able to steer it in other areas, which I think makes China quite different. And this is actually a challenge because there's no other models for whether or not this is going to work or not work. Let me give you an example about South Korea. South Korea also tried to push a lot more money into high-tech, more innovative activities. It was actually quite successful. It's much more innovative than people would have predicted. But there was a consequence. What people don't know is South Korea's growth rate was actually cut in half over the last decade because of this. So I think this is a serious issue for China because China is also trying to put much more money into more highly sophisticated technological new strategic industries.
Go to you, Professor Xiao, about the higher level of opening up. Now, you are based in Shenzhen. That's where the China's reform and opening up policy have been for decades celebrated. So when business people, academics, been hearing about the higher level of opening up, how do you interpret that? How is that likely to deal with some of the current challenges?
Well, I think the opening up is a continuation, with the past tradition of China's reform. But now there are very special challenges, very unique challenges, because the geopolitical tension. And as a result, we are going to have dual circulation. And in that sense, the connection between the two circulation becomes crucial because in terms of attracting people, attracting companies and investments, I think places like Hong Kong would play important role, but Hong Kong is too small. So the integration of Hong Kong with the Greater Bay Area is going to provide a much bigger platform to integrate with, I think, ASEAN and other, other countries, because I think a lot of trade investment will be, away from the United States and actually concentrating on ASEAN and probably Europe. So this is some structure change, which is basically conditioned by the geopolitical environment. And I think also China, the investment environment is actually pretty good in the sense that, even the real interest rate is still positive. And if you look at around the world, because of the inflation in US and Europe, the real interest rate is actually negative, seriously negative. So for long-term investment, I think China, particularly regions along the coast, is pretty good. But China needs to continue to further opening because the COVID and also the geopolitical tensions has unconsciously closed China in the last few years. And that we need some offset policies to really reopen it. And I think this is really a challenge because the environment will be much more complex. But I think this is something China has to do to stop the stagnation of the economy.
More complex and different from earlier times that led to the so-called higher level of opening up. Is that your interpretation?
Yes.
Do you see, Mr. Huang, that as a result of geopolitics and complexity, we are going to see more China towards self-sufficiency with the expense of opening up?
I would say over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a very strong globalization movement. And by globalization, I mean movement of goods, movement of money, and most importantly, the movement of ideas. And that's benefited both the developed countries and the developing countries. And I think it's part of the growth story of China. China's benefited from that process and has participated actively in that process. But the tensions with the United States have changed everything. It started off with Trump's tariffs trying to inhibit the movement of goods. Then you had Biden and Trump trying to restrict the movement of capital back and forth. But most recently, Biden's Department of Commerce put in place a severe restriction of the exports and use of high-tech equipment produced in the United States as well as in other countries. And this is going to retard what I call the flow of knowledge across countries. So as an economist, I basically see that we're entering into a very disturbing era, because if you curtail the flow of knowledge across countries, you're going to curtail the potential for growth across countries. The world has been able to grow at, let's say, about a percentage point or a half faster over the last 20, 30 years because of this free flow of knowledge, goods, and finance. But now the tensions are basically moving in the other direction. And I think everyone's going to suffer a lot. And I think China has got a big issue here. China's benefited from an open system. It favors globalization. It favors the free movement of goods, finance, and services. And it's been moving more and more in that direction. But now the global tensions are going to actually make it much harder.
Professor Xiao, in China's history, contemporary modern history, there were also times about the danger and also the opening up, the reform, vis-a-vis the complexity. How do you see this time people are articulating this debate?
Well, I think if we look back at the history, reform and opening usually happened when China is facing very, very serious challenge. I mean, 1979, 1992, and I think today are actually very similar with external pressures. And usually at this time, China needs to basically increase the internal efficiency and effectiveness of stimulating the economy. So my expectation is that, yes, given the very complex external environment, but China needs a major reform and opening in the sense that this time is focused more on the so-called service sector. Because the manufacturing sector opening has been very successful in the last 40 years, but the service sector is very complicated. It involves people, ideas, and the technology and the money. So this time, the opening is not just a simple slogan. You know, it has to be related to the balancing efforts on national security, social stability. This is something China has to do. You know, given very serious, environments and domestic disruptions by external environment.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. see the difference.
Mr. Huang, from now until March, when the NPC and CPPCC to begin, there are still a few months to go. Many mention these are going to be critical months, both for China's economy to see the trend and also for the rest of the world, even when it comes to geopolitics. If you think about it, midterm election in the United States, there's going to be several multilateral platforms, discussions such as G20 and APEC and things to come. So how do you see some of the crucial signs that you would like to read from now until next spring?
I think to be realistic, we recognize that security issues have become very important in China's agenda. It has to deal with a hostile global environment, is under pressure in terms of technological independence. It has to deal with COVID. Dealing with security is expensive. So a China which grows at, say, at 3% cannot generate the money to deal with it. So at the same time that you're dealing with security, you have to find ways to increase the growth rate or bring it back up to the 5 to 6% level. And the problem is you cannot rely upon the same process or the same growth path that China was following in the previous decade. You cannot rely upon the property market. You cannot rely upon exports, okay? If you rely upon innovation technology, which is of high priority, not many people realize it, but innovation actually slows down the growth for a period of time. You don't get the benefits until 10 years later. So you have a problem. What that means is that China now has to bring up certain changes in the way it's actually spending its money and allocating its resources. And I think that we've not yet seen. So for me, the challenge over the next few months is we have a problem. Security is a major concern. It has to be dealt with. It's going to be expensive. We must keep the economy growing at 5 to 6%, but we cannot do it the same way that we used to. So what can China do in the future to actually grow at a higher rate without spending more money to do it? And that is the big issue and challenge for China. And there are things. Let me just give you one simple example that Chinese scholars have actually highlighted. Hukou reform policies is the major issue here. If you actually freed up or liberalized Hukou, you could raise the rate of consumption significantly. The second thing that would happen is Hukou prevents people from moving to the cities and the areas with the highest productivity. So in China, you have a huge gap between very productive cities and less productive cities because people can't move around. If you eliminate or liberalize there, productivity would increase. So there are studies which show just liberalizing Hukou could increase your growth rate by a full 2 percentage points. If you're only growing at 3, you could grow at 5, and it doesn't cost anything. So these are the kind of very difficult decisions the government needs to make.
Professor Fu, here comes to your expertise, governance, your thoughts, not just on Hukou, but rather on how we are going to see new engines of growth. Do you see that could happen within the next few months, or at least to pave the way for the future?
The physical cost, the institutional, the contextual. Now it's about governance, the institutional cost. Hukou is part of the institutional cost, and there are many others. The Ministry of the Monopolies and what have you. The use of a capital is not used very efficiently. And I can give examples and ideas. Human rationality eventually is a contextual to the governance issue. If you have a better governance to facilitate the production of ideas, ultimately that's the engine of growth. So 2 levels, let me emphasize, that has to do with the governance, institutional level and the ideational course. As we go along, we need to have more nuanced strategy. We need to have new technologies ready before we phase out the old technologies. And I would say we are sort of backpedaling on the process. Green is an important part for the Chinese economy to move forward. Now, if I have my reading of the party's report, green is a big thing, quality over quantity another thing, demand side, a better balance between demand side and the supply side is another, then it's the industrial upgrading. And there, I would add, when we say high quality opening, normally we would say the physical part, the institutional part, the idea parts. Of course, with the change of both domestic content and external content, of course, the issue of security has also loomed large.
Thank you. Professor Xiao.
Well, I think the major challenges for China in the next year or 5 is actually how to stimulate the economy, because the disruptions have slowed the economy. But the stimulation has to come with China's governance capability to, for example, when you have inflation, that's fine if you can actually compensate the so-called the weak group affected by the inflation. So I think China has been overly cautious in stimulating the economy, given the fact that the rest of the world is massively stimulating the economy. And I think in the future, some balance could be achieved by stimulating effectively, but also protecting the weak group and also managing the so-called risk. I think this requires very strong governance capabilities, and I think China potentially could achieve it. And the priority is really to stimulate the private sector and the economy, and it also motivate the local government because the last 3 years of disruption really, stopped a lot of initiatives, and that's something which we have to change. I think the next group of leaders, they have to do that.
Xiaogeng, Yukong Huang, and Fu Jun, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.